Foundations of Western Political Thought. Module 5. The Limits of Reason. Descartes, Hume, and Kant. We take a detour in this lecture, not away from politics, but underneath it. The thinkers we have examined so far made claims. Plato claimed to know what justice is. Hobbes claimed to know what drives human beings. Locke claimed to know what rights we possess by nature. They argued, they disagreed, they built systems, all assuming that such knowledge was possible. But is it? How do we know what we think we know? And if our knowledge is less secure than we imagined, what happens to the grand claims of political philosophy? These are epistemological questions, questions about knowledge itself. They may seem abstract, the province of specialists who enjoy arguing about whether tables really exist, but they have consequences. If you cannot derive an ought from an is, then every moral and political claim floats free of the facts. If reason cannot reach the things that matter most, then something else must ground our convictions. If the human mind shapes what it perceives, then objectivity itself becomes problematic. The three thinkers we examine today, René Descartes, David Hume, and Immanuel Kant, reshaped how the West thinks about thinking. Their conclusions and their disagreements still structure our debates about what we can claim and with what confidence. The route is this: Descartes and the turn to the doubting self, the foundation on which modern philosophy builds, for better or worse. Then Hume, whose cheerful skepticism demolished causation, severed ought from is, and made reason the slave of the passions, all without losing his appetite for dinner. Finally, Kant, awakened from dogmatic slumber, who rescued science and morality by arguing that the mind shapes what it knows at the price of admitting we can never know things as they really are. These are not merely academic puzzles. They determine what political philosophy can claim and whether it can claim anything at all. Descartes and the turn to the subject. We begin with Descartes briefly because he sets the stage. René Descartes was a French philosopher and mathematician born in 1596, whose work marks a turning point in Western thought. Before Descartes, the dominant tradition was scholasticism, the synthesis of Aristotle and Christian theology that had structured European intellectual life for centuries. Knowledge came from authorities: Aristotle, the Church Fathers, the accumulated wisdom of tradition. Descartes proposed something radical in his Meditations on First Philosophy, published in 1641. He resolved to doubt everything that could possibly be doubted, stripping away all assumptions until he reached something certain. The senses deceive us. We dream, we hallucinate, we misperceive. So sensory knowledge is doubtful. The physical world might be an illusion created by an evil demon determined to mislead us. Even mathematics might be the demon's trick. What, if anything, survives this radical doubt? One thing, the fact that he is doubting. If he doubts, he thinks. If he thinks, he exists. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. This is the bedrock, the one thing the demon cannot fake, because the very act of being deceived requires someone to be deceived. From this foundation, Descartes rebuilds. He argues for God's existence, and from God's benevolence he concludes that our clear and distinct perceptions must be reliable. God would not systematically deceive us. The physical world is real after all, though its nature is mathematical rather than sensory. What we perceive as colors, sounds, tastes are subjective experiences. The objective world is extension, motion, mathematics. The details matter less than the move. Descartes has shifted the ground of knowledge from external authority to the individual mind. The question is no longer, what do the authorities say, but what can I, reasoning carefully, establish for myself? This is the foundation of modern philosophy and of the modern self. the autonomous reasoner who trusts nothing that is not past. For politics, the implications unfold slowly. If tradition and authority are not self-justifying, they must justify themselves before the tribunal of individual reason. If each person is a thinking subject capable of reaching truth independently, then each person has a kind of dignity that does not depend on their social role. Locke's rational individuals consenting to government, Kant's autonomous moral agents. These are Descartes' children, and the children grow ambitious. If reason can discover truth by pure thought, then perhaps reason can design society from scratch. The revolutionary constitutions of the 18th century, France especially, bear the mark of Cartesian confidence. Sweep away the accumulated rubble of tradition, start from clear and distinct principles, construct the rational state. Rousseau, as we shall see, takes this path. The results were not what the rationalists expected. But there is a problem. Descartes assumed that careful reasoning would lead everyone to the same conclusions. That reason is universal, and its deliverances objective. What if this assumption is wrong? Hume and the limits of reason. David Hume was born in Edinburgh in 1711 and became the most formidable skeptic in the history of Western philosophy. He was also, by all accounts, one of the most cheerful. "Be a philosopher," he wrote, "but amidst all your philosophy, be still a man." His great work, A Treatise of Human Nature, was published in 1739, when he was only 28. It fell, he said, dead, born from the press. Later he reworked its ideas in more accessible form in An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, published in 1748. The reception improved, but the implications remained troubling. Hume was an empiricist. All our knowledge, he argued, comes from experience, from impressions received through the senses. Ideas are merely faint copies of impressions. We cannot think anything that is not derived, ultimately, from what we have experienced. This seems reasonable enough, but Hume follows the logic relentlessly. Consider causation. We believe that one billiard ball striking another causes the second to move. But what do we actually experience? We see the first ball move, then the second. We see constant conjunction, one event regularly followed by another. But we never see the causation itself, the necessary connection, the power by which one event brings about another. Causation, Hume concludes, is not observed but inferred, and the inference is not rational, it is habitual. We experience regular conjunction, we come to expect it, and we call that expectation causation. But there is no logical necessity involved. The sun has risen every day of human history. There is no contradiction in supposing it might not rise tomorrow. We believe it will because we are accustomed to it, not because reason compels us. This is deeply unsettling. The whole of science rests on causal reasoning. If causation is merely psychological habit, not objective connection, then scientific knowledge is less secure than we thought. It works, it predicts, but it does not have the certainty of logical demonstration. And Hume goes further. The is-ought gap. In Book 3 of the treatise, Hume makes an observation that has troubled moral philosophers ever since. In every system of morality which I have hitherto met with, I have always remarked that the author proceeds for some time in the ordinary way of reasoning, and establishes the being of a God, or makes observations concerning human affairs, when of a sudden I am surprised to find that instead of the usual copulations of propositions, is and is not, I meet with no proposition that is not connected with an ought or an ought not. This is the is-ought problem, sometimes called Hume's guillotine. You cannot derive a moral conclusion from purely factual premises. No description of how things are logically implies how they ought to be. Consider Human beings naturally seek pleasure. This is a factual claim, but it does not follow that human beings ought to seek pleasure or that pleasure is good. You need an additional premise, a value judgment. To get from is to ought. This seems like a technicality. It is not. It means that all moral reasoning rests on foundations that are not themselves established by reason. Somewhere in every ethical argument there is a premise that is not derived from facts, but simply assumed, felt, desire. For political philosophy, the implications are severe. Locke claimed that natural rights exist as facts about human beings. But can you derive rights from facts? Hobbes claimed that self-preservation is the fundamental human drive and built his politics upon it. But even if this is true, does it follow that we ought to preserve ourselves? Why is survival better than death? The gap between is and ought means that political philosophy cannot be a science. It cannot be established by pure reasoning from self-evident truths. At bottom, it rests on commitments that are not themselves rationally grounded. Passion and reason. Hume draws the conclusion explicitly in a famous passage. Reason is, and ought only to be the slave of the passions, and can never pretend to any other office than to serve and obey them. This reverses the classical picture. For Plato, reason should rule the passions. The philosopher king governs because reason gives access to truth. For Hume, reason is an instrument. It can tell us how to achieve our ends, but it cannot determine what those ends should be. The ends come from passion, from desire, sentiment, feeling. Morality, on this view, is rooted in sentiment, not reason. We approve of virtue because it gives us a pleasing feeling. We condemn vice because it arouses displeasure. Moral judgments are expressions of our emotional responses, not discoveries of objective moral facts. This does not make Hume an amoralist or a nihilist. He thinks moral sentiments are largely shared among human beings. We are constituted to approve of what is useful and agreeable to ourselves and others. Society depends on these shared sentiments, and they are real enough. They give morality a practical stability even without metaphysical certainty. We do not need to prove that murder is wrong to know that virtually everyone feels it is wrong, and that feeling is enough to build a society on. But these sentiments are facts about human psychology, not about the structure of the universe. Is natural in the sense that it arises naturally from human nature. It is not natural in the sense of being inscribed in the cosmos or commanded by God. The political implications: if morality is sentiment, then moral disagreement is not simply error to be corrected by better reasoning. People may genuinely feel differently about what is good, and there is no tribunal of pure reason to which we can appeal to settle the dispute. This might seem to support tolerance. We cannot prove others wrong, so we should let them be. Or it might point toward a different conclusion. If reason cannot adjudicate, then moral consensus depends on shared sentiment, and shared sentiment is shaped by families, churches, communities, traditions. Whoever forms the sentiments forms the morality. This is not sinister, it is simply how moral cultures reproduce themselves. The question is whether the shaping is done well or badly, by institutions that have stood the test of time or by those who imagine they can start fresh. Hume on religion and politics. Hume was quietly devastating about religion. His essay of miracles included in the Inquiry argued that testimony for miracles can never be strong enough to overcome the weight of experience against them. A miracle, by definition, violates the laws of nature. But our only evidence for laws of nature is uniform experience. So the evidence against any miracle is as strong as evidence can be. Against this, We have human testimony, and humans lie, exaggerate, believe what they want to believe, and are easily deceived. The contest is not close. His dialogues concerning natural religion, written early but published only after his death in 1776, he knew what trouble it would cause, dismantle the traditional arguments for God's existence with elegant skepticism, the design argument, the cosmological argument, the ontological argument. Each falls to careful scrutiny, not conclusively disproven, but shown to be far less compelling than their proponents imagine. He was careful. He did not openly declare atheism. That would have been dangerous, and for Hume, vulgar. He maintained the forms of religious observance, but the thrust of his thought is clear. Religious beliefs are not rationally grounded. They arise from fear, hope, and the human tendency to personify natural forces. They may serve social functions. Hume was no revolutionary, but they are not true in any robust sense. The Natural History of Religion, published in 1757, traced the origins of religious belief not to rational argument, but to psychological needs. Primitive peoples, frightened by natural forces they could not control or understand, projected human characteristics onto them. Polytheism came first. Monotheism emerged later through a combination of flattery and fear. Each god must be praised as supreme, and eventually one god absorbs the rest. This is religion as anthropology, not theology. Hume does not ask whether God exists, but why people believe he does. The answer is not flattering. Ignorance, fear, and the tendency to see agents where there are only causes. Politically, Hume was a conservative of a peculiar kind, a sceptical conservative. He distrusted abstract reasoning applied to politics. Systems look beautiful on paper, but ignore the complexity of actual human affairs. The social contract, for instance. A useful fiction, perhaps, but not historical fact. Governments arise from conquest, from accident, from the gradual accretion of custom. To pretend they rest on consent is to impose a rationalist fantasy on messy reality. Custom and tradition, whatever their logical credentials, have the advantage of having been tested by time. Institutions that have survived are likely to serve some function, even if we cannot articulate what it is. The radical who would rebuild society according to reason is likely to discover that reason is not as powerful as he thought, and that what he destroys was more valuable than he knew. There is a tension here, and Hume knew it. His skepticism undermines traditional justifications of authority, divine right, natural law, ancient constitution, but his conservatism distrusts the alternatives. If neither tradition nor reason can ground politics, what remains? Convention, habit, the way things are done, not because it is right in some cosmic sense, but because it is established, and disrupting it is risky. We obey government, not because we consented, not because God ordained it, not because reason commands it, but because we are used to it, and the alternative is chaos. This is a modest politics. It does not inspire. It cannot justify crusades or revolutions, but it may be honest in a way that grander theories are not. There is another side to Hume worth noting. His historical method. In his History of England and in essays like Of the Rise and Progress of the Arts and Sciences, Hume explained institutions not by appeal to divine providence or natural law, but by tracing how they arose from human needs, conventions, and circumstances. This anticipates what we now call social science, the attempt to understand human arrangements as products of history and utility, rather than as reflections of eternal truths. Property, for instance, is not a natural right discovered by reason. It is a convention that arose because it is useful. It allows people to plan, to invest, to cooperate over time. Justice itself is an artificial virtue, created by human agreement to solve problems of coordination and conflict. This does not make it less binding, but it changes what we are bound by. We are bound by what works, by what is evolved to serve human needs, not by what pure reason. Kant's awakening. Immanuel Kant was born in Königsberg, Prussia, in 1724, and famously never traveled more than a few miles from his birthplace. He lived a life of such regularity that neighbors reportedly set their clocks by his afternoon walks. Behind this placid exterior was a mind wrestling with the deepest problems of philosophy. Kant credited Hume with awakening him from his dogmatic slumber. He saw that Hume's skepticism, if left unanswered, would destroy not only traditional metaphysics but science itself, or at least our understanding of science as genuine knowledge rather than mere habit. His response was The Critique of Pure Reason, published in 1781, one of the most difficult and important books in the history of philosophy. Kant's strategy was revolutionary. Instead of asking how our ideas can correspond to objects, he asked how objects must conform to our ways of knowing. The mind, he argued, is not a passive receiver of impressions, but an active organizer of experience. It brings to experience certain structures, concepts, and intuitions that shape what we can perceive and know. Space and time, for Kant, are not features of the world in itself, but forms of human intuition. We cannot experience anything except in space and time, because that is how our minds work. Similarly, causation is not discovered in experience, but brought to it. The mind applies the category of cause and effect to make sense of experience. This is why causal reasoning is universal and necessary, not because we have observed it everywhere, but because our minds impose it everywhere. Hume was right that we never observe necessary connection, but Kant argued that we do not need to. Causation is a condition of experience itself, not something derived from it. It is, in his terminology, synthetic a priori, a truth that is not merely definitional, yet can be known independently of experience. This saves science from Humean skepticism, and scientific knowledge is genuine knowledge, because the categories that make science possible are built into the structure of human cognition. We can know that every event has a cause, not because we have checked every event, but because we could not experience events at all without applying this category. Phenomena and noumena. But Kant's rescue comes at a cost. If the mind structures experience, then what we know is experience as structured by the mind, not the world as it is in itself. Kant distinguishes between phenomena, things as they appear to us, and noumena, things as they are in themselves, independently of our cognition. We can have knowledge only of phenomena. The noumenal world is forever beyond our reach. We cannot know whether our categories correspond to ultimate reality. We cannot even know whether things in themselves exist in space and time, since space and time are our forms of intuition, not features of things as they are. This may seem like a technicality, but it has consequences. God, freedom, and immortality, the great concerns of traditional metaphysics, are noumenal. They cannot be known by theoretical reason because they are not objects of possible experience. The traditional proofs of God's existence fail, not because God does not exist, but because our reason cannot reach beyond experience to prove or disprove such things. Metaphysics, as traditionally conceived, is impossible. We cannot have knowledge of ultimate reality. We can have knowledge only of how reality appears to minds like ours. Practical reason and morality. If theoretical reason cannot reach God or freedom, where does morality stand? Kant's answer, developed in his Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals, 1785, and Critique of Practical Reason, 1788, is that morality belongs not to theoretical but to practical reason. We cannot know that we are free, but we must presuppose freedom in order to act morally. Moral obligation makes sense only if we can choose, and so, from the practical standpoint, freedom is real. This is not a proof of freedom. It is something different, a practical postulate, something we must assume for moral life to be intelligible. Similarly, Kant argues we must postulate immortality in God. Morality demands that virtue be rewarded with happiness, but in this life, virtue often goes unrewarded. So we must postulate a future life in which the balance is restored, and a God who ensures that it is. These are not theoretical claims. Kant is not pretending to prove what he has shown cannot be proven. He is saying that practical reason requires what theoretical reason cannot establish. We cannot know that God exists, but we must act as if he does, because morality would otherwise be incoherent. Morality, for Kant, is not grounded in sentiment, as Hume thought. It is grounded in reason itself, but practical reason, the reason that determines the will. Moral laws are not descriptions of what we happen to desire, or commands issued by a divine authority. They are requirements of pure, practical reason, binding on all rational beings as such. The supreme principle of morality is the categorical imperative. Unlike hypothetical imperatives, which command conditionally if you want X to Y, the categorical imperative commands unconditionally. It does not depend on what you happen to want. It binds you simply because you are a rational being. Kant formulates the categorical imperative in several ways, which he regards as equivalent. First, act only according to that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. This is a test of consistency. Before acting, ask yourself, could the principle of my action be universalized? Could everyone act this way without contradiction? If not, the action is wrong. Lying, for instance, is wrong because if everyone lied, the institution of promising would collapse. A lie succeeds only against a background of general truthfulness. You cannot will universal lying without contradiction. You rely on others believing you, which requires that lying not be universal. The liar makes an exception of himself, and this is precisely what morality forbids. Second, act so that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in that of another, always as an end and never as a means only. Human beings have dignity, not merely price. They are not instruments to be used, but rational agents to be respected. This is the foundation of Kantian ethics and of much modern human rights thinking. Slavery is wrong, not because it causes suffering, though it does, but because it treats persons as things. Exploitation is wrong, not because it is inefficient, but because it uses people as mere means to someone else's ends. Third, act as if you were through your maxims a law-making member of a kingdom of ends. This is the vision of a moral community, a world in which every rational being is both legislator and subject of the moral law. In such a kingdom, each person would be respected as an end, and the laws governing all would be those that each could rationally endorse. These formulations are meant to capture the same fundamental idea from different angles. Morality is about rational consistency, respect for persons, and membership in a community of rational agents. It is not about maximizing happiness or obeying commands. It is about living in a way that respects the dignity inherent in rational agency. Consider slavery. Can the principle, enslave others when it benefits you, be universalized? Could you will that everyone act on this principle? only if you could, with your own enslavement, which, as a rational being valuing your own freedom, you cannot. Slavery fails the test. It makes an exception of the slaveholder, treating his freedom as mattering more than the slave's. The categorical imperative exposes this inconsistency. Consider censorship. Can the principle, silence opinions you find dangerous, be universalized? Only if you could, will let others silence you when they find your opinions dangerous. The censor assumes his judgment is privileged. Universalize the principle, and everyone is silenced by everyone else. They cannot be willed consistently. These are political applications of Kant's ethics. They show how the categorical imperative generates conclusions about justice and rights, not merely about individual conduct. Critics have found Kant's ethics too formal, too abstract, too removed from the actual texture of moral life. The categorical imperative may rule out obvious wrongs, but it gives little guidance in complex situations. It tells us what we may not do, but not what we should positively pursue, and its claim to pure rationality may be an illusion. Perhaps even Kant was smuggling in assumptions that are not as universal as he thought. But the power of Kant's vision is undeniable. The idea that morality is about respect for persons, that human dignity is unconditional, that rational beings are not to be used as mere instruments. These ideas have shaped the modern world. Human rights declarations, constitutional protections, the very idea that there are things no government may do to its citizens, these are Kant's legacy, however imperfectly realized. A note on Kant's practical postulates: God, freedom, and immortality. These are not theoretical claims, not proofs of what exists. They are what Kant calls conditions of the possibility of moral life. If we cannot presuppose freedom, moral responsibility makes no sense. If virtue and happiness are ultimately unconnected, morality seems absurd. Why be good if it profits nothing? So we must postulate a moral order that theoretical reason cannot demonstrate. This is Kant reconciling moral hope with epistemic limits, not claiming to know what he cannot know, but claiming the right to believe what morality requires. The political Kant. Kant was a liberal in politics, a supporter of the French Revolution, at least in its early stages, and a defender of republican government, individual rights, and the rule of law. He never wavered in his support for the principles of the Revolution, even as the terror unfolded. Though he condemned the execution of Louis XVI as legally unjustifiable, his political philosophy developed in works like The Metaphysics of Morals, 1797, and his essay, What is Enlightenment, 1784, flows from his ethics. If human beings are rational agents with dignity, then they must be treated as ends, not means. They cannot rightly be subjects of arbitrary power. They must have rights that others, including the state, are bound to respect. Enlightenment, Kant famously declared, is man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity. Immaturity is the inability to use one's understanding without guidance from another. It is self-imposed when it results not from lack of reason, but from lack of courage. Superiode, dare to know. Have courage to use your own reason. This is a call to intellectual independence, and it has political implications. A people who cannot think for themselves will be ruled by those who think for them. Freedom of thought and expression are not luxuries but necessities for a mature polity. Censorship keeps the public in perpetual childhood. Government is legitimate only if it could be consented to by rational being, not actual consent. Kant was not naive about real political processes, but hypothetical consent. A just law is one that free and rational citizens could have agreed to. This is a test, not a history. We do not ask whether people did consent, but whether they could, rationally, have done so. This rules out certain kinds of law. A law that treats some citizens as mere means, slaves for instance, could not be rationally consented to by those citizens. A law that violates the basic dignity of persons fails the test regardless of its popularity. Majority will is not sufficient for legitimacy. The content of the law matters. Kant distinguished between the state of nature and civil society in a way that echoes but modifies Hobbes and Locke. The state of nature is not necessarily a war of all against all, but it is a condition of insecurity where rights cannot be guaranteed. Civil society is established not merely for protection but for justice, for the rightful condition in which each person's freedom is compatible with the freedom of all. Property, for Kant, is not a natural right in Locke's sense. There is no property in the state of nature, because property requires law to define and enforce it. But there is a rational requirement that property be possible, and this generates a duty to leave the state of nature and enter civil society. Kant also dreamed of perpetual peace. In his essay of that title, Perpetual Peace, a Philosophical Sketch, published in 1795, he argued that republican governments, because they require the consent of citizens who would bear the costs of war, would be less bellicose than monarchies. A federation of free republics might eventually abolish war altogether. He proposed preliminary and definitive articles for such a peace. No treaty should contain secret reservations for future war. Standing armies should be abolished. No state should interfere in the constitution of another. The law of nations should be founded on a federation of free states. Hospitality, the right of a stranger not to be treated as an enemy upon arrival in foreign territory, should be universal. This has not happened. The 20th century made a mockery of perpetual peace. But the idea of international law, of human rights, of a global order based on right rather than power, these are Kantian ideas, still operative, still contested. And the United Nations, for all its failures, is a Kantian institution. Human rights declarations invoke Kantian dignity. The dream persists, even as the reality disappoints. How epistemology shapes politics. Let us step back and see what these thinkers have done to political philosophy. Descartes shifted authority from tradition to individual reason. This empowers the individual but also fragments the consensus. If each person judges for themselves, what happens when they judge differently? Hume showed that reason cannot establish what we most want it to establish. Causation is habit. Morality is sentiment. Ought cannot be derived from is. The foundations are less secure than we thought. Kant tried to rescue objectivity by grounding it in the structure of the mind. He saved science and morality, but at the cost of admitting we cannot know things as they are in themselves. We are trapped in our own categories. For politics, several implications follow. First, epistemological humility. If even our best knowledge is limited, then political certainty should be suspect. The ideologue who claims to know exactly how society should be organized is claiming more than epistemology allows. Second, the problem of moral disagreement. If ought cannot be derived from is, then moral disputes cannot be settled by appeal to facts. Something else is needed: sentiment, tradition, power, faith. Which of these is most appropriate for political life? Third, the dignity of the individual. Both Descartes and Kant place the thinking, willing subject at the center. This grounds a politics of individual rights, of respect for persons, of limits on what may be done to people without their consent. But it may also ground a politics of atomism, of isolated individuals without shared commitments, of a society that cannot ask for sacrifice because it cannot articulate a common good. Was he ever in it? The diverging streams. Hume and Kant bequeath us two very different approaches to political thought. From Hume flows sceptical conservatism. the recognition that reason is limited, that custom and tradition embody wisdom we cannot fully articulate, that radical schemes are likely to founder on the complexity of human affairs. This stream runs through Burke, through Oakeshott, through all those who distrust the idea that society can be rationally redesigned. From Kant flows liberal rationalism, the faith that reason can ground universal principles, that human dignity requires respect for individual autonomy, that rights can be derived from the nature of rational agency itself. This stream runs through the French Declaration of the Rights of Man, through modern human rights law, through all those who believe that moral progress is possible and that reason can light the way. These streams conflict. The Humean sees the Kantian as dangerously abstract, deriving aught from pure reason, while ignoring the lessons of experience. The Kantian sees the Humean as unprincipled, defending whatever exists simply because it exists. The conflict plays out in every political debate. Should we reform the institution because reason demands it, or preserve it because tradition validates it? Should we extend rights to new claimants because dignity requires it, or resist innovation because change is risky? Should we trust abstract principles or concrete experience? There is no final answer. Hume and Kant were both right about something and both wrong. Reason is more limited than Kant thought. Tradition is more questionable than Hume admitted. We muddle through, using both, suspicious of both, never finding the secure foundation that would settle the argument. Perhaps that is the lesson. Political philosophy does not end in certainty. It ends in judgment, a practical wisdom to know when to innovate and when to preserve, when to trust reason and when to trust experience. Aristotle would have understood. How to recognize these ideas today? When someone says, you can't legislate morality, they are invoking, perhaps without knowing it, the is-ought gap. Morality is one thing, law another, and you cannot get from factual claims to moral obligations. The law can prohibit actions, but it cannot make them wrong. Wrongness is a different kind of claim. When someone says that's just your opinion as a way of ending an argument, they are being Humean. Moral claims are expressions of sentiment, and sentiments differ. There is no further fact that would settle the matter. We feel what we feel. When someone insists that human beings have inherent dignity, that certain rights are non-negotiable, that persons must never be treated merely as means, they are speaking Kantian language. The United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a Kantian document. So is any constitution that places limits on what majorities may do to minorities. When someone argues that tradition and custom deserve respect not because they are rationally justified, but because they have been tested by time, they are echoing Hume's conservative streak. The burden of proof lies on those who would change, not those who would preserve. When someone claims that reason alone can design a perfect society, they have not read Hume or have read him and disagree. Hume would predict that their scheme will founder on complexities they cannot foresee, on aspects of human nature they have not accounted for, on the gap between the blueprint and the building. When someone says that we must act according to principle, regardless of consequences, they are thinking like Kant. The moral law binds even when obedience is costly. You do not lie to save yourself, because the prohibition on lying is categorical. When someone says we should judge actions by their results, not their principles, they are rejecting Kant. This is the consequentialist tradition, which we will meet when we discuss Bentham and Mill. It is the great rival to Kantian ethics, and the debate between them structures much of modern moral philosophy. And when someone says that the limits of our knowledge should make us cautious about grand political projects, they have absorbed the lesson that all three of these thinkers in different ways teach. Descartes doubted everything to find certainty. He found less than he hoped. Hume followed reason and found it led to skepticism. Kant rescued what he could, but only by acknowledging that ultimate reality is beyond our grasp. Epistemological modesty is the political legacy of these debates. We do not know as much as we think we know. Our confident pronouncements rest on foundations that are less secure than they appear. This is not a counsel of despair, but of caution. Act, but do not be too certain. Reform, but do not destroy what you do not understand. Reason, but remember its limits. Pause and consider. Before we move on, let me leave you with a question. Hume says we cannot derive ought from is. Kant says morality is grounded in practical reason, not in facts about human nature or divine commands. But consider, if morality is truly independent of facts, if no description of reality can establish a moral conclusion, then morality floats free. It is not anchored in anything outside itself. Is this liberating or terrifying? Liberating, because it means we are genuinely free to choose our values. No fact about human nature, no divine command, no law of history can compel our moral conclusions. We are the authors of our own morality. Terrifying, because it means nothing grounds our values. If someone disagrees, there is no further fact to appeal to. Moral argument bottoms out in brute commitment, and commitments can conflict with no rational resolution. This is the situation we find ourselves in. The Enlightenment promised that reason would settle everything. Hume and Kant, in different ways, showed that reason has limits. What fills the gap? That question will haunt the rest of the course. Next, we turn to Rousseau, who rejected the dry rationalism of the Enlightenment and sought the source of politics in something deeper, nature, feeling, and the corrupted heart that civilization has produced. End of Module 5.